Okay, so as an attacker, maybe we don't only want to log in, but we also want to steal data. Let's imagine some programmer implemented this function. This is Python code now, by the way. So he gets a get parameter called ID, and then he uses this get parameter in an SQL query in the where clause. Then he gets all rows returned from this SQL query and prints them out on the website. So now as an attacker, we want to get all the data out of the database. How could we do that? Well, one example is the union method. Well, if the code is reachable via the article endpoint, we could set the ID to something that doesn't exist, for example -1, and then we could use a union select. Union select is an SQL feature, and what it does is, if you imagine a result being returned as a table, the first rows are the actual result, and then union just appends more rows to the result. So by setting the ID to something that doesn't exist, there's no result coming back, and therefore the first result of the union query will be displayed on the web page. And in this case, the user and the password from the users table will be displayed instead of the article description. But as an attacker, how would we actually know what tables exist and what columns are in these tables? Well, we can leverage this union technique to get this information. For example, in MySQL databases, there's a database available called information schema. This is used for the internal data that the database needs to run, and this database information schema has a table called tables, and this table just has information about the table names available to the user. And why is it 2 here? Well, the union select needs to return as many columns as the original select. So in this case, we write a 2 here just so the query works. And then we limit this by 0, 1, so only the first row is returned. Afterwards, we can, if we want the second row of this union select, we can change this to 1, 2, 2, 3, and so on. So then we have all the table names. What would we do next? Well, next we could get the column names of the table just with the columns table from information schema. And since we now know the table name, we can filter efficiently and say, okay, we only want the columns of the table called users. There's a more efficient method, but it's not available in all SQL databases. You can do something called a group concat. Where you can concatenate the different rows that you get returned via a delimiter, for example, comma. And then you don't have to do this stuff with limit and go through it one by one, row by row. You can just concatenate all the rows and get your result immediately in one with one query. Okay. Another thing I want to mention is that with some database drivers, not all though, stacked queries work. So in that case, you could just, if you control this ID parameter, you could use a semicolon, similar to the command injection vulnerabilities, and then just start a new SQL statement. And this would work on some database drivers. And in this case, you just add another SQL statement that updates the users table and sets the role to admin for all users.